You know, one of the things that I enjoy most about working in television and radio in my career is meeting fascinating and interesting people. I'm Jim Masters, CUTV News. We're here in Rocky River, Ohio, just outside downtown Cleveland, to meet somebody who's renowned in the field of psychiatry and who also is an accomplished author of some 9 books. Matter of fact, she's working on her 10th book now. Her name is Dr. Joanne Denko. She has been in the field of psychiatry for many, many years, and she's inspired and impacted so many lives. And she's done that now through her books as an author. We've come here to her home to meet her, to interview her, but also to give her the opportunity to share these rich stories about why she loves doing what she does so much. But I want to go back early in your life's journey to when you first decided to take on and study the field of psychiatry. What was it about psychiatry initially, early on, that spoke to you, Doctor?
Well, I would have to say that before deciding to pursue psychiatry, I had to decide on the area of medicine. And I did this when I was in college. I had thought at one point I might like to go into law, and I decided against that, although I did a lot of debating and things like that, and decided on medicine. Then when I had to decide on a specialty, the way I came to psychiatry was that it is the specialty that is placed between, that its position is between the sciences and the humanities. And I have always liked literature, high quality literature, and I have in the history of science, and I thought that it was a specialty that suited my talents and that I fit well in the talking area, in drawing people out and helping them express what we needed to learn about.
So, in your field of psychiatry, can you tell us about some of the amazing things that you've worked on and some of the accomplishments that you were responsible for within that field?
Psychiatry requires a 3-year residency, which I had, but it was divided between 2 universities because after 2 years, my husband had a job that moved him to another university, so I finished it at the second one. The first one was the University of Michigan, where, among other things, they offered us the opportunity to pursue the master's in psychiatry degree while we were in our training program. And I just loved doing that because this involved studying, taking courses in some of the ancillary subjects like sociology and anthropology. And so I did that while I was in training. And among other things, we had a journal club at which we would do presentations to our peers about work in the literature. And this led me to do a presentation, which eventually I decided would be a good subject for a paper in psychiatry. I did a study on psychiatric disorders in primitive peoples, pre-literate peoples around the world. And this became one of my first psychiatry papers, which was published in the Journal of the American Medical Women's Association when our chapter was asked to provide to do a whole journal article. And during this training program, I was learning to deal with patients of different kinds. I went on to Ohio State when my husband went there, and while I was there, I had the experience of having a woman with an unusual condition, but no one had discovered it yet. I discovered when I was examining her, as we were taught to do, head to foot, very carefully. I felt under her jaw for enlarged lymph nodes because they can indicate a number of things. She didn't have that. But when I so much as touched her under her jaw, her facial muscles went into spasm. And this was not right for anything that she had or that we knew she had. We knew she was depressed. She was not talking. She had seizures, but no explanation for facial spasms. I did it again, it happened again, and I realized that her calcium must be low. And so I sent that to the lab to be tested, and it was. They called and said it was the lowest they had ever tested in that laboratory. And this pointed to the 4 tiny little glands that lie on the thyroid gland, known as the parathyroids, which regulate calcium metabolism. And when she was treated for that, from sitting mute and staring into space, not talking, not answering questions, within a few days she was playing ping pong on the ward. And this subject was of interest in the medical department because this was in their area. In fact, it was in endocrinology. And for their weekly rounds, to which the whole medical community attended, they wanted to hear about her case, which I presented because I was the treating physician. And my husband was sitting there, and a friend of his took an empty seat beside him and whispered to my husband, "Who's that girl presenting the case?" And with my husband's quick wit, he responded, "Why, that's no girl, that's my wife." Adapting an old joke, "Who's that lady I saw you with last night?" Yeah. So having had this interesting experience, I had the librarians search for other reported cases of this condition where the parathyroid glands, which normally work so well that you don't even think about them, were not functioning, and they found about 100 of these. So I collected these, studied them, and compared them to my woman who had this condition, and wrote a paper 2 different ways, one for a psychiatry journal and the other one for the dissertation for my master's dissertation, which I hadn't finished at the first university because we had moved to the other one. But that was the perfect subject for that. And the one for the psychiatry journal, being too long for their standard format for their journal that they put out every month, they publish separately in what they call a monograph supplement. That is to say, a small paper-covered book. Mine was about 100 pages long. And since it was freestanding, separate from the journal, it became my first book. That more or less launched me into this, what I see as a dual career of practicing psychiatry, adult psychiatry, and having various things that are given to me in psychiatry or in my own life that offer literary opportunities and pursuing them as they occur to me of something of value and worth. And I have done this in 2 or 3 genres: biography, poetry, and a study that I did when the Mensa Society was brought to my attention, a society for which entrance into it requires an IQ in the upper 2%. And I thought to myself, hearing about this, this is great. They have collected for me, they weren't doing it for me, but as it happened, they had collected a population, a study population of people with this high IQ, perfect ones to study. So I prepared a questionnaire survey with all open-ended questions and encouraged them to write as much as they wanted to about my various questions. Some people said they'd never had so much fun taking a questionnaire. And I used this on the the chapter in Columbus when we were there, and then when we moved to the Cleveland area on the chapter in Cleveland. And that became my second book, Through the Keyhole at Gifted Men and Women, that was called. And as I say, various things that in my life were attracting my attention. When we started having children, I noticed every now and then that someone would do an unexpected, heartwarming, jewel-like event that I thought to myself, you know, this is poetry worthy. Why aren't there mother poets? Because they must have children doing things like this all over the world. And I've never heard of a mother poet, but I tried to become one. And I wrote a number of these experiences. After a while, there were some that were not happy, but part of the texture of motherhood or parenthood, and I wrote that into my first poetry book.
So amazing work that you've done. Let's talk about the books themselves. Starting off with the book that you wrote that is filled with all kinds of incredible poetry. Can you share something from that book for us?
This is the book, Into a Mirror and Through a Lens, and the title was selected at the suggestion of one of my friends in a writer's workshop that I went to, who said that this ought to suggest that this is not a standard mother, but this is a mother who is a trained observer. And that was how I came up with the mirror and lens part of it. As I was collecting these poems, I collected them actually from the time of conception to the time when one was married. And I considered that a suitable ending point for that. I thought I'd read you a short one. From the time when one of the children went through the most florid Oedipus complex I had ever seen or heard of. 40 times a day, he would run up to me and fling his arms around me and say how much he loved me and wanted to marry me when he grew up. And then 10 minutes later, he'd be back with the same message. Eventually, he suddenly realized that there was something wrong with this. And like a curtain dropping on the end of an act, he said just once, and that will be at the end of the poem what he said. The poem I call Winsome Oedipus. And it goes, 3 candles blown, you'd fling your chubby arms around my neck, my thigh, my waist, whatever you could reach, and back 10 minutes later, gush forth in a torrent the selfsame words of love. 40 times a day for several months, each time as if a primal rhapsody. Mommy, when I grow up, I'm going to marry you. Hands in dishwater, I tried each time to sound as much in love, to equal your first rapture, yet never to dissemble. That'll be nice, I'd say, or whisper in your shell-pink ear, I love you too, my darling. And a daughterless mother, think, may you someday bring me a daughter we can both love. Then, like the closing of a scene, poignant, ephemeral, doomed, your cycle ended, and for your curtain call, a cynic who had lost in love, you said once only, Mommy, when I grow up, I'm going to marry White Paw. That way I can have puppies. Eventually, when we were traveling, particularly to see areas of ecologic interest, I began writing poems relative to that, but always intended to have a teaching reason or something beyond the beauty of the moment itself. For example, when we climbed 4 hours to see the gorillas in Central Africa, and sometimes the sometimes on slippery bamboo, and the guide would sometimes have to give me a little boost, and the guides would be carrying chests of cold drinks on their heads and having to help us up the mountain. But then we had an hour to watch the gorilla family. And what impressed me, there was the silverback, there were a couple of females and several of the young around. And the silverback, a 250-pound male, was babysitting. He had a little boy gorilla on his shoulder and a little girl gorilla in his lap, and she was sucking on her toe. And that became one of my poems that I collected in my book, in my poetry book, Interlink. So that was how I used those experiences like that.
So what I like about the gorilla story is when you're probably the second psychiatrist that I've interviewed who has had a similar experience. Tell us about how that experience influences your work as a psychiatrist, seeing nature, seeing wildlife, seeing, in this particular situation, having gone up those 4 hours in that massive hike, the gorillas in action.
They are among the primates that are the closest to us, and they have these beautiful chestnut eyes. And in this particular case, this family, we were close enough to them to see the individual hairs and observe this. I called it, they held salon for us for an hour. And we had seen others of the primate families that I took one son on a trip to Borneo to see orangutans, and they were of interest because that translates man of the forest. They are in the trees most of the time, rarely come down, and were of interest in from that standpoint. And were also having to be protected as the gorillas in Africa were. It's a problem because the population encroaches on them, and they consider these bush meat if they can. And this is a terrible thing, and the conservation people are trying to get the idea across that and by preserving the animals, they are preserving their own tourism future, bringing people in to see these marvels. And this, and part of our fees went to the conservation project of the gorillas in Central Africa.
Let's talk about your husband, Charles W. Denko, a brilliant individual, renowned in the medical field. Tell us a little bit about him.
Oh, we were both lucky. He had, through a number of scholarships and so on, he had his PhD in biochemistry. He also had an impairment from polio in childhood and had had surgical repair by the Shriner organization and walked always with a limp, but by then comfortably so that he could live a normal life, thanks to the Shriners. He got his degree in biochemistry and was working in a biochemical lab when an Army recruiter came around who wanted chemists for the Army. And he said, look, I may be 4F, but I'm working as a chemist in civilian life. I can do it in the Army. And they said, by golly, you can. And they took him. And they assigned him first to a nutrition laboratory in which his job was to study the rations that the men had to eat the same thing day after day in the field if they were too far away from kitchens and regular cooked meals, to make sure that this didn't have a deleterious effect, and it didn't. He studied this in conscientious objectors, they were very happy to learn that operation was good. Then they sent him to Europe in the occupation, where he had a number of very interesting assignments pertaining to chemistry, cleaning up the DP camps, treating them for typhus as they came in and things like that, and finding the families of Jewish orphans who had been orphaned by the Nazis, killing their parents, but finding their families to link them up with their families again. That was another one of his jobs. He had fascinating jobs in the Army, and his professor when he was studying for the biochemistry degree said, you know, Denko, for what you want to do, you ought to go to medical school. And he said, no, there's no way, I can't. I can't afford anymore. And this was before he had even been in the Army. By the time he got back, the GI Bill had been passed, and so he did go to the medical school on the GI Bill. And then he had his really lucky break. He met me, and I was arriving in medical school at that time.
What are some of the amazing things and accomplishments that he's noted for in his career?
An interesting thing I might mention, to go back to the biography of my late husband. After I got that written, I thought to myself, you know, he would be a great role model for young people contemplating a career in science or whatnot, instead of the crummy role models that they have these days. And so I thought, what I really should do is a shorter form of the biography for high schools. And that was the reason for the second biography. And I mention that at this point because in the second one, I have used an idea from my publisher. When I'd have a blank page for some reason, I would put a quotation, often a quotation of Chuck's, that he was, as I said, a very humorous man, but always of a gentle nature, never sarcastic, never nasty, always in good taste, and very witty, as in the case of when he said, "That's no girl, that's my wife," and he did another one. These are the things I have scattered through that biography. One time, one of the younger boys had an assignment to think of units of measure besides the usual metric and British that we use, and we were sitting there thinking of the amperes and light years and angstrom units and things like that. And then he said to our kid, ask your teacher if he knows what a millihelen is. And I said, a millihelen? I never heard of a millihelen. What's a millihelen? And Chuck said, beauty sufficient to launch one ship, mine. This is what I mean by the cleverness and gentleness of his humor. He was twice elected the most humorous man in his class, in high school and again in college. Of course, I didn't know him either time, not having met him until medical school, but that certainly was well deserved. Osteoarthritis, which is the arthritis of old age, and on the whole not as crippling as rheumatoid arthritis, those and other forms of arthritis, of which there are altogether more than 100, he told me, and he had seen all but one, which is in some remote place only. His distinction, or what he introduced that is new was that the story used to be that naturally these joints, having been walked on all these years, all that wear and tear, wore each other down. And his contention was that osteoarthritis and many of the others also are not wear and tear diseases, they are biochemical diseases, and they are caused by a biochemical imbalance that causes inflammation to form in these places. And he had been working on ways to eliminate this inflammation. He began, back when he first started working in this, he began by studying the metabolism of cartilage in rats, and found that the cartilage of rats was taking up radioactive sulfur, which was the way he was studying this. And later, after he finished with the rat work, he worked with the serum, with the blood of patients with whatever kind of arthritis they had, to try to study at what stage they were in this process of the inflammation in there and how to reverse it. He once came in second worldwide for an award called the Karl Nachmann Award from Germany for his life work in rheumatology. And for that, he had to write out what he had done in his whole career. That part, among other things of a technical nature, I have included in the long biography, which is why I did the short biography, so it would leave out those things, his complicated, his 125 article bibliography and so on, and so that they are, his life is available at these two different levels. I had vignettes. I would ask people to write something. Their sons wrote various things, or in one case, the son wrote a very touching letter of appreciation to his father. That's included, although he didn't have to be alive for that, but he was. Well, he had received the letter for one thing, and I was working on this. He wrote some of his experiences up that he'd had in the occupation in Europe for me, and he was very supportive of all the projects that I took on in or out of psychiatry. And he would, in psychiatry, for example, when I would have an unusual patient, as I did, he'd say, now keep careful notes and then write this one up, and was right.
The book that you're writing on the Denko family, of course, it's really sort of like a legacy in a way for your family members and generations to come, the grandchildren, great-grandchildren, right?
Well, I realized it began when our grandchildren were coming about the time most of our friends were getting great-grandchildren. It was really along in our lives, and I realized that we would not live long enough for them to know us as adults. And I wanted them to know about their grandfather in particular because of his very interesting career in rheumatology, not to mention what I've just told you that he did in service. And my contention is that the only thing that is really preserved intact is black ink on white paper. And so I had been hearing these stories from him all all our lives. We had been married a number of years, and about his family. And I had him there still. He was in decline at this point. He had Parkinson's disease, and eventually I was able to keep him at home. We had the garage out here made over into a bedroom, bathroom, parlor arrangement that he stayed in to the end of his life. But he was there, and he even wrote some of the vignettes. I had other people writing things for the biography, letters that some people wrote. His one niece of his, one nephew, wrote their appreciation. His younger colleague, whose work he influenced a great deal, and who, when he was in decline, would come to the garage out here and work with Chuck, getting his massive data ready for publication so it wouldn't be lost. By the time Chuck couldn't do this on his own. And I'm eternally grateful to Charles Malamud, this younger man who helped preserve that. And that was well, and one of the things about our life was that he knew that he would be giving talks internationally at congresses about rheumatology as he was working on it. And we took advantage of those to travel. So whenever there was a meeting, we would go there and see that part of Europe or that part of whatever it was, and had an opportunity to see many of the larger cities that way before we began traveling what became known as ecotourism, traveling to see the polar bears up in Canada along the Hudson Bay, and the gorillas, as we mentioned, in Africa, and so on. And despite his bad leg, he was able to do almost everything. He was not able to do the gorilla climb, however. That was, as I said, 4 hours at about 80 degrees up. And unfortunately, he couldn't do that. We had the 2 younger boys along on that trip.
So that must be a real massive undertaking. I mean, you're talking about, ancestors and pulling up all this archival research. That is hours of preparation, hours of writing. That must be a very daunting process for you. What's this process like, putting that book together?
The process about that in my process is still like this, is that when I get an idea, I run for a piece of paper to write it down right away, or I'll forget it. In fact, even when the children were little, if I would dash off to write something, somebody would say, "Who did something funny now?" Because in order to preserve anything, I'd have to write it down. You don't remember what you think you'll remember.
Did you find that writing the book, both books, was a cathartic, a therapeutic experience for you? I'm sure there was emotion connected to it as well.
Not in a sad sort of way, but in a good kind of way. It was very nice, as is what I'm doing now. Very nice, because as I reimagine or recreate the many years of my past, I remember things that I might not have remembered if I hadn't been writing them myself. As I work with it, I suddenly remember an incident that I thought I had forgotten forever, and it's back. It will trigger it. Mm-hmm.
The book Envy. You and I had chatted on the radio interviews about your career and about your work as an author as well. And one of the books that stood out was Envy. What was your initial vision and your purpose for writing Envy?
What happened was that in the early 70s, I think 1973, in Harper's Magazine, there was a short article, only about 10 pages long, on the topic of envy. And that article really hit me. I had never thought about envy particularly, I had occasions when I had been envious of this person or that person, but I had never put that together as envy. I hadn't realized why I had been uncomfortable at this time or other. And I read that article, and it came together for me. So I kept the article, and I began collecting ideas, examples of envy that I saw in other people, in patients, in myself, in family members, and also in literature. About this time, Amadeus came out, this marvelous story about Salieri's envy of Mozart. And it's been fictionalized, but it's a very interesting example. I collected things from literature, going all the way back in the Bible, all the way back, in fact, to the Gilgamesh epic, the oldest recorded literature. And in the Middle Ages, there were many stories that dealt with the 7 deadly sins, of which envy was the second, and they would be personified, and they were interesting. Let me show you that, that book, because this cover is an illustration of one of the stories and how they were dealing with envy back in the Middle Ages. The tongue coming out of the woman's mouth is a snake, and she's riding on a dog, which is another symbol of envy. I don't know why exactly. And so we were very happy to be able to use this picture for the book on envy. It happens that the Herman Melville, who was noted for Moby Dick, his final novel, Billy Budd, has a marvelous description of envy in it. And interestingly enough, several years ago, John Updike wrote an article about the final work of various novelists, literary people, and so on, and included this. What was remarkable to me about it was that Updike had missed the envy in it, which was not stated as such, but was shown throughout the dealings of the characters with each other. A very, very interesting book with that envy determinant in it.
What are some of the things that you hope, Doctor, people absorb from your writings?
Oh, I have chapters on ways of coping with envy, which is a terribly uncomfortable thing, and we become ashamed. No nice person would be envious. That just isn't a good way to be. And so naturally, you wouldn't want anybody to know that you were that way if that happened to be the case. And I have suggestions like trying to analyze that if you can't have what the other one, be what the other one is, envy deals more with being, innate properties, like people want to be the best tennis player or best chess player or whatnot. And if they can't be that, well, what other satisfaction can they look for? And I recommend things like that as a way to deal.
So, envy and jealousy, they're not necessarily one and the same, right?
As I say, envy is not something, well, let me put it the other way. Jealousy is something where you could have it. You could have it. Jealousy, the well-known one is the love triangle. With jealousy, is possible to have the love of the one that you want and not to have it. Envy is to be something, and to be the champion, this or that, to be the one who writes the most beautiful music, as Salieri wanted to be in prayed to God that he could do, and he had done everything right. And Mozart hadn't. He was kind of a not. He was portrayed at least as not a very cultured person, and he didn't deserve it, as Salieri saw it. But he had been given the talent by God that Salieri had wanted, and that's envy. That's basic envy.
You're continuing to write, or is this last book that you've referenced, the book about the family, the Denko family, is that going to be your last work?
At the moment, I write when I have an idea, but the idea has to be something that fits into a category that I'm working on. I don't do them kind of in a miscellaneous style. What is happening now, or over the past few years, I haven't just recently written any, but I have written poems about nature that I wrote after the book, and those are going to be in an appendix or in the back of the bio book, so that they will have a place finally. I have those collected, in other words, and they're going to go into that, along with another section I'm writing, or I have written a section that I call Denko Rules for Living, a number of bits of advice, and that's going to be in the back also. This is the 10th that I'm working on, the one about the everyone that I can, or everything about everyone that I can find ancestral to the 6 grandchildren, except about their grandfather, who was in the other bios. He's left out of that one. Is there a working title for that book yet? The subtitle, I can't remember the title, but I thought it was fairly generic, and the subtitle is, I think, The Story of a Remarkable American Family, and then the date's 1862, which is the oldest date I have to the present.
How much of you, Dr. Denko, is in your books?
Probably more when the subject deals with other people, although the same, there's more of me in the nature poems, because my overall theme of that, and the reason for the title Interlink, is that these are all intended to show our relationship to nature in one way or another. And I try in these books as best I can for them to be scientifically accurate. And furthermore, I don't follow the popular style of writing in disconnected phrases. My poetry is all in complete sentences. It's at this interface between science and the humanities that I favor.
Did you find that writing the book, both books, was a cathartic, a therapeutic experience for you? I'm sure there was emotion connected to it as well.
This last one is the hardest for various reasons. For one thing, it divides down more as you get closer in time, because we have children and they have children, and then they have a wife, and I've got to put in material about that woman because she's also ancestral to the children, and so that is how the complications increase.
Is it the depth of the research to get their information?
I have one daughter-in-law whose older brother is a real nut about the genealogy and the internet. He will look up stuff for me, but mine is not genealogy. I am looking for interesting stories and what people did. And there are a lot of those, and they illustrate such a diversity of behavior. And this is what I think makes it interesting. I don't know if anybody outside of the family will ever read it. I think that they would find it interesting if they would.
How would you say that psychiatry has evolved and changed over the years?
Oh, it has changed drastically. When I was in training, the very first of the tranquilizers came out. I don't remember what the first one was called, and then soon we had Thorazine, and that was a major psychiatric breakthrough. In those times, we were treating patients mainly by talking to them and relating everything to their life, their upbringing, their relationships with their families. This is largely not done now because, for one thing, it's a very costly method because it's so time consuming. And now my son, who is a psychiatrist in Pittsburgh, in the medical school there, is doing pretty much the opposite of what I did at the start, at least. In all the years in between, the products, the antipsychotic products, the antidepressant products came out, and he is now teaching the young psychiatrists coming in training, coming into practice, a method of studying what is unique to the patient, the condition that the patient has, but also his body, his other problems, heart problems or whatever, and the various possible medications and which ones have the most likely to have positive benefits for such a person and the fewest negative results. He has had students who come out to him and say, "Why hasn't anybody else ever told us this?" And I don't know why they haven't either. It seems like a very simple and obvious method, but I never had it presented to me this way. And this is, I'm trying to get him to write this up for publication too. He does articles, as I have done. It seems like a very difficult world to live in now also. My son also has made the point that comparing that he is now paid by the hour as much as I was paid 40 years ago, which means that he is paid much less in buying power than he was in the past. Things have become, standardized. And he has the experience, this is in Pittsburgh, that patients that they have maybe known at the hospital before come in, they're all out of control, and he patiently works and decides which medications to remove and which to put them on and gets them in balance again and sends them out. And then pretty soon they're back in the same problem again, taking the same 4 medications that fight against each other. And somehow those 4 became popular in the Pittsburgh area, and patients are coming in with the same ones that are not right together, and over and over. And when they go back to the practitioner on one that's working, on a set that's working, which he organized in the hospital, then they change them back to it. Very, very strange.
When you do look back at your life, Doctor, which again is something that is, you can really go deep, and it's tough to sort of summarize that all up. What do you think are some of the greatest impacts that you've made?
As I said, I find that the things that will last most, I figure are always have got to be written down. And I feel most accomplishful about the books because the patients that I have helped, and I have run into them or run into their relatives on the street later, and they've expressed appreciation for what I had done for them or their mother or whoever the case might be. That has its own progressive effect in that these people can be of greater value because of what I've done. But what anybody can learn about, they can only learn about at this point from what I've written down. And that's why I'm one of the reasons why I've written the things, and hope that they will have that effect.
Are you always still writing things down for future books?
Oh, I don't think I'll write any more books. It's too long and involved. I don't at the moment have any idea for any any unitary thing to write of a shorter nature. And at the moment, I am bending all my efforts to finishing this family biography book, which I knew it was going to be complicated and involved, and it is.
Yeah, much more than just all the research.
Well, it has too many. It has a lot of people in it of necessity because of the nature of what I took on.
If somebody's considering going into the field of psychiatry today, I mean, the world has changed. What would you say to them if they're watching this and they want to enter that field?
For one thing, I have for years been advising people to avoid medicine. It is difficult. It is difficult, and it's frustrating these days what they have to go through. And with our children, for example, we advise the same thing, unless they would go into academic medicine, which they did, both of them. But to be in practice out there coping with everything you have to cope with in the regulations, in the insurance, and problems like that. It's not like being a physician when I became one.
The book that you're writing on the Denko family, of course, it's really sort of like a legacy in a way for your family members and generations to come, the grandchildren, great-grandchildren, right?
There is that, but at the same time, I would like, if I had a chance, I'd like to put it into a time capsule. And I don't know of any way to do this. I think, and I've been trying as I go along, to point out how the story that is being told relates to the circumstances at the time that it was happening, and how, because they will be seen as very different from what the readers have, because the readers can only be from now on. And so I try to draw these things to their attention. Among other things, sometimes changes in price. One of my sons always talks about when he was a kid, ice cream cones were 25 cents. And of course, when I was a child, they were 5 cents. Some of the things that I wanted for my children and for my grandchildren, I've been trying to accomplish for them. Namely, some getting away from these megalopolises, these big cities. I have a small summer place up on Beaver Island in the northern end of Lake Michigan. It is like a world apart to go to that. And that is up there for them and for their grandchildren in trust, for subsequent generations in trust, as a way for them to come together if they get there at the same time, which is often very difficult, but a way to see the countryside the way it was when I was growing up, which was partly why I picked that place. When a friend of mine was beginning to had built a cottage up there, and then I built a summer place up there too. I like to think that it's hard to get to Beaver Island because I don't want a lot of people getting there. it's it it's 2.5 hours by ferry or about 20 minutes by little airplane, but it's a place apart, and I guess people have to find their own way that way.
Dr. Joanne Denko, a psychiatrist and author, somebody who sees things with a unique perspective. What I noticed in this interview is how she loves to thread things together in life, whether it's people, nature, her experiences, her stories, and she shares it with all of us through her wonderful writings, but also through her many, many years as a psychiatrist. Truly a fascinating woman. If you'd like to learn more, you can go to her website. In Rocky River, Ohio, just outside Cleveland, I'm Jim Masters, CUTV News.